I'm telling you, it's just PR, she giggled, leaning in conspiratorially to her friend. I watched her from across the ballroom, her champagne flute gesturing dismissively. She manages the Navy's Facebook page or something? It's quaint. Her voice was just low enough to be polite, but her contempt was billboard-sized. Just then, a polished, amplified voice cut through the chatter from the main podium. And now, it is my distinct honor to introduce our keynote speaker. Chloe's smile froze, her eyes widening slightly, annoyed at the interruption. The host continued. An officer whose work in signals intelligence has fundamentally altered naval doctrine. Please stand for the architect of Operation Neptune's spearhead, Vice Admiral Catherine Carter. I saw Chloe's wineglass tremble. Her face drained of all color as I calmly stood from my own table and began walking toward the stage. Her head whipped between the stage and my empty seat, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. That moment was 2 weeks in the making. It all started at a loud, chaotic family barbecue, ostensibly for my brother. I'd just arrived and the air was thick with the smoke of cheap charcoal and heavy praise. My brother, Mark, the eternal golden son, had just been promoted to regional manager at some mid-level tech firm. To hear my father tell it, you'd think he'd just been crowned king. Standing next to him, practically glowing, was his new fiancée, Chloe. Chloe was a junior partner at a city law firm, and she carried herself with the unshakable certainty of someone who believed her resume was a bloodline. As I grabbed a drink, Chloe turned her high-wattage smile on me. "Oh, Catherine, Mark told me you're still doing that Navy thing?" she asked, her tone dripping with saccharine condescension. "Is it PR or recruiting? So sweet of you to stick with it." Before I could even answer, my father, Richard, chimed in. He was a man who'd done a 2-year Army Reserve stint 40 years ago and acted like he was Patton. He chuckled, patting Mark's back. "Someone's got to do the soft jobs, honey. Not everyone can be a shark like Mark." I just forced a smile, the exhaustion of the last 72 hours, a high-stakes NATO war game, settling deep in my bones. "It's complex," I managed. This was the same old song. My achievements, like my master's degree in applied mathematics or my advanced strategic certifications, were just nice. Mark's sales quota was legacy. Chloe just waved her hand dismissively, already bored. "Well, listen, Mark and I are having our real engagement party in 2 weeks at the City Club. It's very exclusive." She paused, as if doing me a great favor. "You must come, if you can get away from, planning the base's bake sale." A cold, familiar stillness settled over me. I pulled out my phone, already knowing the date. "I can't. I have a mandatory work engagement that night. It's the Navy League gala." Chloe actually laughed out loud. "A gala? For PR? Oh, that's adorable." "Well, don't worry," she said, turning back to Mark. "You can just send a gift." She mistook my silence for weakness. She had no idea she just insulted me on the one night I couldn't ignore it. To understand the reckoning that followed, you have to understand the 2 lives I was living. This duality, it was my entire life. My family's perception of me was a story they'd written back when I was 15 and hadn't made the varsity team. They never bothered to write a new chapter. Just last month, Mark closed a big sale, and my father held an impromptu toast at dinner, praising his killer instinct. When I mentioned I'd passed my strategic command review, a brutal 6-month process, my father just patted my head. "That's nice, honey. Did you see the bonus Mark got?" The bonus. As if that was the only metric for success. It was just one more entry on a long list, like the time my college scholarship was just lucky. While Mark's C+ average was working hard under pressure, Chloe's arrival only amplified this. She was obsessed with the language of civilian success. Everything was prestige, clout, or making partner. My career, a life of service and immense responsibility, was just government work. To her, it was a quaint hobby I hadn't yet outgrown, something you do when you don't have real-world ambition. To them, I was just Catherine, the quiet, unsuccessful daughter, the one who'd peaked in high school. They needed me to be small, so they could feel big. And then, there was the reality. My world was a place they couldn't even imagine. It wasn't a corner office, it was a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility. It was sterile, silent, and had no windows. The only light came from glowing screens and a row of clocks on the wall. Zulu, DC, Pearl Harbor. This was where the soft jobs happened. My flag aide, Lieutenant Commander Evan Hawk Riley, entered. He was a man who'd seen combat in the Gulf and was now my right hand, and he knew exactly what my PR job entailed. He didn't knock, he just appeared, his face a mask of professional calm. "Ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The data from Sea Dragon is collated. The intelligence from ONI suggests a red flag posture from the 7th Fleet. We need your authorization for the Whisper Protocol SIGINT operation." My heart didn't race. It just engaged. I processed the intel, the complex variables, the human cost. Chloe was worried about the guest list for her party. I was worried about a miscalculation in the South China Sea. I nodded, and we moved to the VTC suite. I sat at the head of a massive polished table, my face reflected in its surface. On the screens around me were the faces of other high-ranking officers, captains, admirals, all waiting. This wasn't a sales meeting, it was a command decision. "Authorize Whisper Protocol," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. "Divert Task Force 3 to Waypoint Bravo. I want real-time updates from Comsublant, and get me the SecNav on a secure line." The room moved with quiet, terrifying efficiency. I was a Vice Admiral, an noon, a 3-star flag officer. My rank was higher than 99.9% of the entire United States Navy. At home, my opinion on what to have for dinner was routinely overridden by Mark. In this room, my signature could move billion-dollar assets and thousands of sailors. My family only respected the power they could see, a paycheck, a fancy title at a law firm. They had no framework for military authority, no concept of strategic responsibility, especially not in a woman, and especially not in me. For years, I let them have their narrative. It was easier. It kept the peace. But Chloe hadn't just insulted me. By mocking my work engagement, she'd belittled the office I held and the uniform I served. It was time to introduce her to the other Catherine, the real one. As I listened to Chloe's laughter fade, something in me clicked. It wasn't the hot flash of anger I used to feel. It was something different. Something cold and precise. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to have an emotional confrontation. I'd tried that for 20 years, and it was like screaming into a void, my words dissolving before they ever landed. No, this situation didn't call for emotion. This called for a procedural correction. The gala wasn't just some work dinner I had to attend. It was an event where I was the guest of honor. They only respected what they could see, the trappings of success. So I decided I would finally let them see. I sat in my formal office, the silence a stark contrast to the barbecue. I picked up the phone and dialed Mark. I let the persona they'd built for me settle over my voice. Polite, a little small, slightly apologetic. "Mark," I started, "I'm genuinely devastated I'm going to miss your party. This work dinner is mandatory and it's a huge honor for my department." I let that hang in the air, knowing how he'd interpret department. "In fact, I have a table. I would be so honored if you, Chloe, and Dad would come as my personal guests." I heard him cover the phone, but his smug voice was still perfectly clear. "Oh wow, your own table? Moving up, Kath." He yelled to Chloe. "You hear that? Catherine's got a table at her PR awards." I heard Chloe's distinct tinkling laugh in the background. "How charming," she called out. Mark got back on. "Yeah, Kath, sounds great. Chloe says we can stop by for a drink. It'll be a fun story. But we are leaving early for the real party, okay?" "That would be wonderful, Mark," I said, my voice even. "I'll have the invitations sent." I ended the call and the mask of just Catherine vanished. My aide, Commander Riley, was waiting by the door, tablet in hand. "Hawk," I said, my voice back to its normal register. "The guest list for my table at the gala. I'm adding 3 civilians. I gave him the names, Richard Carter, Mark Carter, and Chloe Vance." He didn't blink. He just made a note. "Understood, ma'am." They'll need standard visitor clearance for the National Naval Museum's main hall. I'll process the e-invites and security pre-clearances immediately. Just like that, it was done. A formal military security protocol was set in motion for 3 people, who thought they were dropping by a high school awards night. They had no idea their names were being run through a federal checkpoint. They thought they were doing me a favor, gracing my little dinner with their presence, a quick stopover before their real life. They had no idea they were walking into the lion's den, into the very center of my world, by my personal invitation. The official invitations were sent via secure channels the next day. Chloe, of course, texted me a photo of the heavy gold-embossed envelope. Her message read, "Wow, so extra. Can't wait to see you get your little certificate." The trap was set. All they had to do was walk into it. The Navy League Gala was nothing like they'd expected. The ballroom at the National Naval Museum was vast, a cavern of marble and gold, and it was packed. Hundreds of guests milled about. A literal sea of dress white uniforms punctuated by ball gowns and the dark suits of defense contractors and U.S. senators. The air itself felt different, heavy with prestige and quiet, serious power. My family, in their civilian formal wear, looked small. They tried to hide their awe, of course. Chloe, clutching Mark's arm, leaned in and whispered just loudly enough for me to hear, "Wow, they really go all out for this. It's like a costume party. Look at all the medals." My father, Richard, just scanned the room, his eyes wide. "A lot of brass here," he muttered. "Must be some important people." I found them near the entrance. I was wearing my full Vice Admiral's mess dress uniform. The dark blue jacket was adorned with my ribbon rack, aiguillettes, and, most importantly, the 3 large silver stars on my shoulder boards. They looked right at me, and saw nothing. They saw the costume Chloe had mentioned. "Catherine," she said, with a bright, false smile. "You look official, very on theme." I just nodded calmly. "I'm so glad you could make it. Please, enjoy the cocktail hour. I have to check in with the secretary." Chloe waved her hand, that same dismissive gesture from the barbecue. Right. Go do your PR thing." I turned and walked away. I saw them watching as I approached a 2-star rear admiral, who immediately snapped to attention and rendered a sharp salute. "Admiral," he said. I nodded, then turned to greet a senator I knew from the Armed Services Committee, shaking his hand. I glanced back. My family was watching, a little confused, but I knew exactly what they were thinking. They thought I was handling the talent the way a PR person would. They still had no idea. We were seated at my table, right near the front. The lights dimmed. My family, having finished their meal, was already looking bored. Chloe and Mark were discreetly looking at their phones under the table, probably making plans for their real party. My father, at least, was paying mild attention as the MC, the Secretary of the Navy himself, took the stage. "Tonight," the Seknov began, his voice booming through the hall, "we are here to honor a leader whose strategic vision has fundamentally altered naval doctrine." I kept my eyes forward, but I could feel the energy at my table. Chloe was whispering to her friend again, the exact one from the ballroom. Mark was checking the time. My father was sipping his water. The secretary continued. "An officer who has served this nation in the shadows, the architect of Operation Neptune's spearhead." My father's head tilted slightly. He'd probably read that name somewhere. "It is my distinct honor to introduce our keynote speaker and tonight's guest of honor." A spotlight hit the stage. Vice Admiral Catherine Carter. The sound was immediate and deafening. The entire ballroom erupted. It wasn't just applause, it was a thunderous, rising ovation as every person in uniform, dozens of admirals, generals, officers from every branch, snapped to their feet. I pushed my chair back and stood. I watched Chloe's smile freeze solid. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, darted from the stage to my empty seat, and then back to me as I began to walk. I saw Mark's jaw drop. He looked like he'd been punched, his hand coming up to tug at his suit collar, which suddenly seemed far too tight. And then, my father, his military-obsessed brain finally connected the dots. The uniform, the ribbons, the 3 stars on my shoulders. The title, the Secretary of the Navy. He stood up so fast his chair screeched backward on the marble floor, a sound that cut through the applause. His hand came up, shaky and involuntary, in a partial, pathetic salute. He was paralyzed, staring at his daughter with a mixture of dawning horror and, for the first time in my life, terrified respect. I reached the podium and tapped the microphone. The room fell instantly silent. I looked out over the sea of faces, my colleagues, my peers, and then I let my gaze rest just for a second on my family. They looked like statues, utterly insignificant. "Thank you, Mr. Secretary," I said, my voice calm and clear. "Tonight I want to talk about the nature of information, because the most dangerous threat isn't the one you see. It's the one you underestimate." My father had spent my entire life teaching me the importance of rank. In the end, it only took 6 words from the Secretary of the Navy for him to finally learn who outranked who. When I finished, the applause was different. It wasn't the polite clapping I'd heard for other speakers. It was a thunderous, sustained ovation. In an instant, I was surrounded, not by family, but by my true peers. A senator I respected gripped my hand firmly. "Brilliant speech, Admiral. Just brilliant." A 4-star general I'd worked with on the Joint Task Force clapped me on the shoulder, his voice gruff with approval. "Catherine, that was a magnificent breakdown of the SIGINT challenges. We need to talk about that whisper protocol application for the Pacific Fleet." This was my world. This was the language I spoke. This was where my complex job was understood, where my little certificate was recognized as the bedrock of national security. Across the room, I saw them. My family. They were a tiny, silent island in a sea of celebration. No one approached their table. No one spoke to them. They were completely, totally irrelevant. They were just 3 civilians in expensive clothes, frozen as the world they saw, desperately respected, celebrated the one person they'd spent a lifetime dismissing. The spotlights had moved to me, and in doing so, had cast them into a shadow so deep it was as if they weren't even there. They looked small. I saw my aide, Commander Riley, make his way to their table. His movements were precise, his face a perfect mask of professional calm, but I knew him. His eyes were ice. I couldn't hear his words from across the room, but I knew the script. "Mr. Carter? Miss Vance? The Admiral asked me to ensure your car is ready. The public portion of the event is concluding." There was no malice in it, just procedure. But the subtext was a guillotine. "You are dismissed." I watched them stand, my father's movements jerky and wooden, Chloe pale as a ghost. There were no goodbyes, no final, angry glares. They just left. The walk of shame from the grand ballroom, through the high-ceilinged lobby, and into the silent elevator must have been deafening. Chloe, the woman obsessed with clout and prestige, her entire worldview shattered by 3 stars on a shoulder board. Mark, the golden son, the shark, now just a man in a suit, following his father out the door. And my father, the man who lived and breathed the performance of rank, had just been summarily dismissed by an officer under my command. That night was a tectonic shift. 6 months later, I was no longer just managing a single operation. My office was in the Pentagon, E-ring. The brass nameplate on the door was simple and final: Vadim C. Carter, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations, Information Warfare. My strategy, Neptune's spearhead, the one born in that sterile skiff, was now standard fleet doctrine. This was my new reality. My briefings were with the CNO, with members of the Joint Chiefs. My team, my real family, was a collection of the sharpest, most dedicated and most brilliantly cynical minds I'd ever known. They challenged me, they respected me, and they collaborated with me. My authority wasn't a question, it was the foundation of our work. I was in total command, respected not for my last name but for my competence. I was in the middle of reviewing fleet readiness data when an email popped up on my secure terminal. The subject line hit me like a jolt, from Dad. For a second, just a second, my heart hammered against my ribs. That old, familiar reflex. That old, desperate hope. I opened it. It was short, the words typed out like hesitant footsteps. "Catherine, I had no idea," it began. "What you've done, The things they said about you at that dinner. I'm proud. I don't know what else to say. I read on, my face impassive. Chloe and Mark broke off the engagement. She said she couldn't look at him, or me, or anything to do with our family after that night. The email ended with a single, hesitant question. A question I'd waited my entire life to hear. Can we talk? 10 years ago, that email would have been my salvation. It would have been the validation I craved, the apology I'd replayed in my mind 1,000 times. I looked at the words. I had no idea. I'm proud. Can we talk? I felt nothing. Not anger. Not triumph. Not even pity. Just neutrality. A quiet, calm, and total detachment. The cold, heavy weight I'd been carrying my whole life, the weight of their disapproval, it was just gone. My peace, my sense of self-worth, was no longer his to give. It was no longer dependent on their apology or their understanding. It was mine. It was earned in silence, in sterile rooms, and under immense pressure. I took a slow sip of my coffee. My cursor hovered over the email for a long, quiet moment. Then I clicked the archive button. The message vanished. A sharp knock came at my door. Hawk entered, holding a briefing folder. Ma'am, the CNO is ready for your brief. I stood up, smoothing the jacket of my uniform. I felt light. I felt present. Thank you, Commander, I said, my voice clear and strong. Let's go. I walked confidently out of my office, past the nameplate, ready for my next challenge. My family spent my entire life trying to fit me into a box they could understand. They never realized my world was the ocean, and they were just a single angry wave. If you've ever had your expertise dismissed by people who were supposed to be on your side, tell us your story in the comments. In this community, we salute your rank.